I'm glad to have this opportunity to share something of my Christian faith. My name's Colin Sinclair. I'm a minister in Edinburgh, and for a year Brian MacLeod did some of his training in our congregation. For the last year, Ruth and I had an extraordinary time in my role as moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. After the Assembly week was over, Ruth and I spent the rest of the year visiting throughout Scotland, the rest of the United Kingdom, and abroad as well. I've been given for the year a theme: Jesus said, "Follow me." And I tried to use that theme to explore what following Jesus really looked like, what discipleship was all about, and told a number of stories that you could find in the Gospels, trying to make them alive and relevant and practical for people who were listening. Although throughout the year the programme was always busy, it was exceptionally busy when Ruth and I went to pay one of the 4 presbytery visits that were planned each year for the Moderator. And this was to be our first presbytery visit, and the programme was packed morning, afternoon and evening, as Ruth and I would go and meet with a presbytery, but also with the civic community, see some of the work done by local charities, meet people in their businesses, and engage at every level with what it meant to be part of that community, all the time trying to show what it meant to follow Jesus. I had a lot of preparation to do, but was somewhat thrown when just a few days before we were due to go, I got a phone call from one of the organising committee, one of the local ministers, who said delightedly that the secondary school had invited me to address a school assembly. Well, that was a great opportunity. But then he added, but they've asked if you will speak on human rights, which is what they've been studying. It's part of their curriculum. I have to confess my face fell, because although I'd prayed about human rights, I really didn't think I had all that much to talk about, and certainly not in a way that would be interesting to secondary school pupils. I turned quickly to Google and I read about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I amassed a whole series of facts. But as I look at what I'd written, the words dull and boring came to mind. And so I had to turn and say, Lord, what do I say? How can I make this opportunity something worthwhile and not something that's just going to be a real turn-off to these secondary school youngsters? 2 days before we set off by train up north to our first presbytery visit, my secretary invited me to come back to 121 George Street, the Church of Scotland headquarters, because in there was an opportunity to meet with a delegation who would be delighted to meet with the Moderator. The delegation had come from abroad and they were on their way to the Scottish Parliament, but also wanted to meet leaders in the Church of Scotland to thank both Parliament and Church for their support for their guest who had come to Scotland. I didn't know much more about it than that. So I arrived and welcomed them into my office, and we sat down together, and the 2 Scottish-based people explained that they came from an organisation called Christian Solidarity Worldwide, rather like a specifically Christian version of Amnesty International. And their job was to advocate for Christians around the world where they were being intimidated or restricted or imprisoned or persecuted. And they come specifically because they wanted me to meet Lawyer Dai, who had come from Vietnam. He was accompanied by his interpreter, and he wanted to thank the government and church for writing, praying and advocating for his release from prison. So I said, well, what did you do? He said, I was a human rights lawyer. You can imagine how my ears pricked up, and I took notes in the conversation that followed. And I just want to share the story that he told me that I would then go on to tell to the secondary school in a week's time. You see, back in 1989, over 30 years ago, as a young man, he had gone from Vietnam on a course to East Germany. And in the time when he wasn't at meetings, he'd wandered around and he'd gone into a souvenir shop and he'd picked up a souvenir, which he thought he would wear around his neck, and it looked attractive. When he joined his party, one of his colleagues said to him, I didn't know you were a Christian. He said, I'm not a Christian. He said, well, why are you wearing a cross round your neck? He said, I just thought it looked attractive. What does it mean? And so his colleague told him the story of Jesus and the story of the cross. Well, Lawyer Di, not a lawyer at that stage, I have to say, said, well, I'm not a Christian, and I just bought it because it looked like something nice to wear. Well, he said the colleague, well, you may not be a Christian, but maybe God has brought this opportunity to make because he wants to introduce you to the Lord Jesus. After the conference was over, Lawyer Di went back to resume his studies to become a lawyer. And over the next 10 years, he found and indeed sought out some followers of this Jesus whose symbol was a cross. And over the next 10 years, he himself came to a living and personal faith. Once he was qualified as a lawyer based in the big city, he became aware that some of the Christians in Vietnam, not in the city but out in the rural areas, were being discriminated against because of their Christian faith. And as a lawyer, he felt he could stand up and defend them, and he did, and he wasn't very popular with the government. But then he became aware that there were other groups of people, not Christians, who were also being persecuted because they had a faith, or they believed in something different from the government line. And so as a Christian and as a lawyer, he felt he should stand up for their rights, as well as protecting his fellow believers in the church. And so he came, almost by accident, a human rights lawyer. Well, this was too much for the government, and he found himself being charged with undermining the authority of the government, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison, which was later turned into 4. He was debarred as a lawyer, and then he was put under house arrest for a further 4 years. Towards the end of that time, his house was broken into by organised thugs, and he himself was taken away from the house, and he found himself having all his personal possessions taken, and he himself was thrown into the cold sea. When a deputation from the United States came to meet him because Christian Solidarity Worldwide had raised his case with Christians in America and Germany and in Britain and in other parts, he wasn't allowed to meet them, and indeed he was put under arrest without being charged with anything. And the days and the weeks and the months passed, and when he'd been under arrest again without trial or conviction for 600 days, the people went outside the Vietnamese embassy and they chalked 600 to note that his circumstances had been noticed by both the church and the government in the West. Meanwhile, the church was praying. The church in Vietnam, the church in Germany, the church in America, the church in the United Kingdom, praying for Lawyer Di. Again, a group came to meet him, and again they were prevented from doing so. And then he was sentenced to a further 15 years imprisonment. Just think of now how long he had been out of circulation. And then wonderfully, in an answer to prayer, he was released, but he was also banned from his own country and had to go into voluntary exile. When he went back to his home to be reunited with his wife and family, among the very few things he was able to take were the things that he wanted to take, and they included 300 letters written to the family and to him to advocate for his release, to promise him their support, and to assure him of their prayers. He talked in graphic detail of what it would have been like in prison, about how sometimes he had to filter water 7 times through his sock before he could drink it, and how if the water wasn't in some ways cleared of impurities, it gave him stomach upsets and left him ill. He talked about some of the mental torture he'd received, and also about some of the unpleasant conditions he'd had to endure. But he also talked about knowing that he hadn't been forgotten. He said that one of the letters that had particularly touched him was only 25 words long and had been written by a 6-year-old, telling him not to turn his back on Jesus and not to forget about his wife. And he said it was that little letter that made a difference. He said not all the letters and cards that were written, that were posted, got to him. Some got to his family, but others were blocked by the guards. But the guards knew that the world was watching and the world was caring. And he now, released, wanted to thank the church and thank the government for seeking his release and for their prayers. Well, I told that story in the high school, and the head teacher afterwards said you could have heard a pin drop as they imagined this quiet, slight figure who had found faith in Jesus, who had lived for Jesus, who had suffered for Jesus, who had remained tall for Jesus. I didn't need to tell them a story about Jesus said, "Follow me." I told them a story rather about someone who had kept on following. And I hope whatever you face, you'll have discovered that the great adventure of faith is not to just hear about Jesus, not even to believe in Jesus, but to follow him yourself wherever he leads. God bless you, everyone.